I buried my wife 10 years ago. I stood at her grave, and I was looking directly at her face. For 10 years, I told myself I saw her face in strangers.
What's wrong?
This time, the stranger turned around. Beside her stood a girl I had never met in my life, and she was looking at me with my own eyes. 10 years of grief taught me exactly what losing her felt like. Nothing prepared me for the possibility of losing her twice.
We need to talk somewhere safe.
She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She said, "We need to talk somewhere safe." That's when I understood life. She hadn't just been hiding from me.
The last time I saw my wife's face, it was printed on a memorial pamphlet folded in thirds, resting on top of a closed casket that the funeral director had gently explained to me would remain empty because the lake never gave her back. That was 10 years ago. So when I stood in the middle of the Millbrook Falls Harvest Festival on a golden October afternoon, kids running past with cotton candy the size of their own heads, someone's dog very seriously stealing kettle corn off an unattended blanket, Ethan having just informed me with the total confidence of a 15-year-old that the caramel apple stand was objectively the best one in 3 counties, and I saw a woman laugh behind a pie stand in a way that made my entire chest cave in. I told myself, the way I'd told myself 100 times over the past decade, that grief plays tricks on tired eyes. Then she turned fully toward me, and it wasn't a trick. It was Sarah, 10 years older, thinner in the face, her hair a shade darker than I remembered, but unmistakably, impossibly, my wife. And standing beside her, holding a mason jar of honey in both hands, was a girl who couldn't have been older than 16, watching me with a pair of hazel green eyes I recognized instantly, because I saw them in the mirror every single morning of my life. I want to tell you, I ran toward them immediately. I didn't for almost a full minute. I simply stood there in the middle of that crowded square, unable to move, unable to breathe, trying to reconcile 10 years of funerals and birthdays and empty chairs at the dinner table with the impossible fact standing 60 feet away from me. But to understand exactly how impossible that fact was, and exactly how crazy the truth turned out to be once I finally heard it, you need to go back to the night I lost her the first time. If you have ever had to grieve someone you loved without ever really understanding why they were taken from you, stay with me until the end, because the answer to that question is not the one I expected, and it is not the one you're expecting either. Sarah and I met in college, in a required chemistry lab neither of us wanted to be in, and married 4 years later in her parents' backyard, under a string of lights her father had put up crooked on purpose because he thought it looked more honest that way. We dated for 2 years before I proposed, on the same dock behind my parents' lake house where I would later teach our son to fish. And Sarah cried so hard when I got down on one knee that our golden retriever at the time, thoroughly alarmed, tried to physically insert himself between us. She said yes anyway, dog included. We settled in Millbrook Falls, the small lakeside town where I'd grown up, where I took over my father's home renovation business, and Sarah worked as a nurse at the regional clinic. We had our son, Ethan, when I was 34, and for a while our life together was exactly the kind of ordinary I'd always secretly hoped for. Saturday morning pancakes, a leaky roof I never quite got around to fixing on my own house, Sarah humming off-key in the kitchen while she packed lunches. There was a version of Sarah I knew completely, down to the specific way she chewed the end of a pen when she was concentrating, and there was, I would eventually learn, another version of her entirely, one she had spent years quietly protecting me from ever having to meet. I remember teaching Ethan to fish off the end of our dock the summer he turned 4. Sarah sitting behind us on the weathered wood with her knees pulled up, laughing every time Ethan shrieked at a nibble on the line, insisting the fish were laughing back at him. Moments like that are the ones grief holds onto the hardest, I think. Not the big milestones, but the small, unremarkable Tuesday evening kind of happiness that you don't realize you're memorizing until it's the only thing you have left. Looking back now, there were small things I noticed at the time and simply filed away without asking. Sarah would occasionally take a phone call outside on the porch, voice low, and come back inside a little too composed. Once, a dark sedan idled at the end of our street for the better part of an afternoon, and she watched it from the kitchen window with an expression I mistook for simple curiosity. She kept a small locked box in the back of our closet that she told me held old photographs from before we met, and I never once asked to see inside it because I loved her, and loving someone I believed then meant trusting the parts of their life they weren't ready to open yet. She also, I remembered much later, kept a second phone in the glove box of her car that she told me was a backup for work, and flinched just once when a stranger at the grocery store called out a name that wasn't quite her own, but wasn't nothing either. At the time, I filed all of it under the ordinary mysteries every marriage contains, the small private corners a person is allowed to keep for themselves. I didn't yet understand that some private corners exist because a person is protecting the people they love, not withholding from them. The night everything changed, Sarah had taken our daughter, a second pregnancy we'd been overjoyed about, a little girl we'd already named Grace, to visit her sister 2 towns over, a drive she'd made dozens of times before. Ethan, 5 years old, had stayed home with my mother while I worked a late renovation job. A storm rolled in hard and fast that evening, the kind Millbrook Falls gets maybe twice a year. I was still on the renovation site when my mother called, her voice too calm in the specific way people get right before they fall apart, telling me the county sheriff's office had phoned the house looking for me. I remember driving to the lake road with my hazards on the entire way, some instinctive part of me already understanding, before anyone told me anything official, that the version of my life I'd left the house with that morning was not the version I'd be going home to. Somewhere along the lake road, Sarah's car had gone through the guardrail and into the water. Search crews worked for 4 days. Divers went back into that lake for the better part of a week, working against a current strong enough to have moved wreckage nearly a quarter mile from the point of impact, and each evening a sheriff's deputy I'd gone to high school with would find me on my porch and tell me, as gently as a person can deliver that particular sentence, that they hadn't found anything new. They eventually found the car, submerged nearly 40 feet down in a stretch of the lake known for a violent undertow, but they never found her, and they never found 6-year-old Grace, who investigators believed had been strapped into the back seat when the car went in. The official report called it presumed drowning, bodies unrecovered due to depth and current. I held a funeral for both of them in the same week I should have been decorating a nursery. I want to tell you I remember every detail of that week, but the truth is grief that sighs erases as much as it creates. I remember Ethan asking for almost a year afterward, when Mommy and his baby sister were coming home from their trip, and I remember not having any version of an answer that wouldn't break both of us completely. The 10 years that followed were, in their own quiet way, the proudest work of my life. I rebuilt my business, mostly so I could set my own hours and never miss a single one of Ethan's baseball games. I learned to braid hair badly and then eventually competently learned which stuffed dinosaur was load-bearing to bedtime and which one could be left behind on trips. Learned to answer questions about his mother with honesty instead of comfortable silence, even when honesty hurt both of us. When Ethan was 8, his elementary school held a Mother's Day breakfast, and rather than skip it, he asked if I would come instead, then spent the entire event visibly working out how to introduce me to his teacher without either of us having to explain anything out loud. I've never been prouder or more heartbroken in the same 20 minutes. There was a nagging detail that never quite left me. The divers had recovered the car almost entirely intact except for a rear door that investigators noted, almost as an aside in their report, had been forced open from the inside before the vehicle settled on the lake bottom. I asked about it once, years later, and was told currents could explain almost anything down there. I chose to believe that, because the alternative, that some part of the story didn't add up, was harder to carry than grief itself. By the time of the Harvest Festival, Ethan was 15, taller than me by an inch, embarrassed by roughly 90% of what I said in public, and standing beside me eating a caramel apple when I stopped walking mid-sentence and never finished my thought. I don't remember what I'd been saying. I remember only the particular gutting sensation of watching a dead woman laugh 60 feet away from me in the middle of a crowd, and the girl beside her, watching me back with my own eyes set into an unfamiliar face. I told Ethan I needed a minute and pushed through the crowd before I'd fully decided to move, weaving past a hanging string of lights, past a family blocking the narrow gap between two stands, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. By the time I reached the pie stand, they were gone. I stood there like an idiot, scanning a sea of unfamiliar faces, until I spotted them again near the gravel parking area at the edge of the festival grounds, Sarah's hand tight around the girl's wrist, both of them moving quickly toward a modest sedan. "Sarah," I said, and my voice cracked on a name I hadn't said out loud to another living person in 10 years. She stopped walking. Up close, the 10 years showed in ways the distance across the festival square had hidden, a faint scar along her jaw I didn't recognize, the beginnings of gray at her temple, a wariness in the set of her shoulders that hadn't been there in the woman I married. And yet everything else about her was so completely, achingly familiar, that for one disorienting second I forgot to be angry at all, and simply stood there relearning the specific shape of my wife's face. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Two people standing in a gravel lot at dusk, while a bluegrass band played faintly behind us, staring at each other across a decade that had somehow just collapsed down to 20 feet of empty space. When she finally turned around fully, I watched every emotion I'd ever felt about her cross her face in reverse order. Fear first, then grief, then something that looked almost like relief. The particular relief of someone who has been carrying a secret so long that even having it discovered feels, for one unguarded second, like being allowed to put something down. "Not here," she said, glancing past my shoulder toward the crowd, an old, practiced kind of watchfulness in the movement that told me this wasn't the first time she'd scanned a parking lot for someone specific. "Please, Daniel, not here. I'll explain everything, I promise you, everything, just not here, and not tonight, not with Ethan somewhere in that crowd." Grace, still holding the mason jar of honey she'd carried the whole way across the festival grounds, watched the entire exchange without a single word, her eyes moving between her mother's face and mine with the careful, assessing stillness of someone who has spent her whole life learning to read a room for danger before anything else. I wanted to demand answers on the spot. I wanted to shake her or hold her, or both at once, but something in the tightness around Sarah's eyes stopped me. A fear I recognized instinctively as real rather than performed. And so instead I asked her one question, whether Ethan and I were safe. And she said yes, quickly and firmly, before adding, quieter, that she couldn't promise the same about herself and the girl beside her. She gave me an address, a small rental house on the edge of town, and asked me to come alone the following evening. I drove home in a fog so complete I don't remember passing 3 of the 4 turns, sat across from my very alive son at dinner, and said absolutely nothing about the fact that his mother had been standing in a parking lot an hour earlier, 10 years late, and apparently still running from something neither of us understood. The next evening I sat across a small kitchen table from a woman I had buried, in a rental house that smelled like someone else's life, while she told me a story I still have trouble believing even though I lived through the aftermath of it. Before she'd ever met me, Sarah had spent 2 years in a relationship with a man named Victor Kessler, a controlling, meticulous man 12 years her senior, who treated affection as a form of ownership and reacted to any attempt at independence as a personal betrayal. She'd left him quietly, moved 3 states away, and rebuilt her entire life. Met me, married me, had Ethan, believing that chapter was permanently closed. It wasn't. Roughly 11 years ago, Victor resurfaced, having tracked her down through an old mutual acquaintance and made it unmistakably clear that he considered Sarah's new family an obstacle rather than a fact, and that he intended to remove that obstacle one way or another. He never once, she told me, made an explicit threat that a court could act on. No direct statement, no physical act, nothing that translated cleanly into a police report. Instead, there were flowers left on our porch with no card. A car that idled at the end of our street for hours at a time. A single anonymous letter mailed to her work address containing nothing but a photograph of our house. It was, Tom told me later, a deliberate strategy. The specific patience of a man who understood exactly how much fear he could generate while staying just outside the reach of the law. She went to the police, they opened a file, issued warnings, offered what protection they could, and told her honestly that without a specific, provable act of violence, there was only so much the system could do to stop a patient, wealthy, careful man from watching and waiting. Sarah made a decision in those final weeks that I still don't know whether I would have had the strength to make myself. Through Tom Riley, a retired detective and old friend of her late father's who had watched Victor's pattern of behavior escalate from the very beginning, she arranged to disappear, not just herself, but Grace, the daughter Victor had specifically fixated on once he learned of the pregnancy, treating the unborn child as proof that Sarah had truly, permanently moved on. Tom had been close with Sarah's father for over 30 years, had in fact been the one to walk Sarah down the aisle at our wedding after her father passed 2 years earlier, and had spent his entire career, before retiring, working exactly the kind of cases where the law's normal timeline moved too slowly to save the person it was meant to protect. He helped Sarah stage the accident using a genuine storm and a stretch of lake road he knew had claimed real vehicles before under conditions that would leave a search convincingly inconclusive. She left Ethan out of it entirely, on purpose, believing, based on everything Victor had said and hadn't said, that his fixation was on her and on the pregnancy specifically, and that Ethan, safely tucked away that night at his grandmother's, would remain invisible to a threat aimed only at the family Victor believed still belonged, in some twisted sense, to him. It was, she told me, her hands wrapped so tightly around a coffee mug that her knuckles had gone white, the single hardest decision of her life, made in the space of 9 days, with a newborn's safety and a 5-year-old's safety weighed against each other in a way no parent should ever have to calculate. For 10 years, she lived under the name Sarah Monroe, moved twice more when Tom flagged possible sightings of Victor in nearby states, worked nursing jobs under careful new credentials, and raised Grace to understand only that they were keeping themselves safe from a dangerous man, without ever fully explaining who that man was or who they'd left behind. She told me she'd followed Ethan's life in careful, indirect ways for a decade. A cousin who still lived in Millbrook Falls and occasionally, without knowing why, mentioned him in passing emails. The town's public Little League photos posted online each spring, small second-hand proof that he was growing up safe and loved, which she'd used, she admitted, as the only medicine available for a grief she'd never been allowed to properly feel in the open. She kept, she admitted quietly, a single folder on an old laptop of every second-hand photo of Ethan she'd ever managed to find. A blurry shot from a regional science fair, a grainy Little League team photo where he was squinting into the sun. And she would look through it, she said, on the nights the guilt got heavier than the fear, which by her own count had been most nights for the better part of a decade. She'd come back to Millbrook Falls 3 weeks earlier, cautiously, after Tom confirmed that Victor had finally been arrested on unrelated federal fraud charges months prior and was believed to be held without bail pending trial. She hadn't planned on being seen. She told herself she only wanted to stand close enough, just once, to watch her son from a safe distance before deciding whether reappearing was even possible. I sat with all of it for a long time before I said anything, watching Grace hover uncertainly in the kitchen doorway, a 16-year-old girl meeting her father for the first time in her life, holding herself with the particular careful stillness of someone who has spent a decade learning not to take safety for granted. I thought about the second phone in the glove box, the flowers with no card, the dark sedan idling at the end of our street, and felt an entire decade's worth of half-noticed details rearrange themselves into a single coherent picture. The way a photograph left too long in a drawer finally makes sense once someone hands you the negative. I won't pretend the anger wasn't there. 10 years is a long time to grieve someone who was, in her own telling, choosing an impossible kind of survival rather than choosing to leave me. But grief and anger, I discovered that night, can occupy the same chest at the same time without canceling each other out. And underneath both of them was something that surprised me more than either: a fierce, immediate, entirely unearned love for a girl I'd known for exactly 40 minutes, simply because she had my eyes and my late mother's stubborn chin, and absolutely nothing else I recognized yet. I wish I could tell you the story ended there, with a long overdue reunion and a slow, careful rebuilding. For about 4 days it seemed like it might. And then Tom Riley called Sarah's cell phone at 11 at night, his voice tight in a way I'd only heard once before, to tell her that Victor Kessler's federal case had collapsed on a procedural technicality that morning, and that he'd walked out of custody a free man roughly 6 hours before anyone thought to warn us. We didn't wait to find out how fast he could move. I called Detective Patricia Wynn, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator Tom had worked with years earlier, who'd kept a quiet, informal eye on the original file long after the department officially closed it. And for the first time in a decade, Sarah told her entire story to law enforcement out loud, in full, with witnesses, with documentation Tom had carefully preserved for exactly this possibility. Detective Wynn didn't waste time being skeptical. She'd apparently flagged Victor's release the moment it hit the system that morning, and had already begun coordinating with federal marshals on an active stalking and endangerment case that predated his fraud charges by nearly a decade. The 4 days between that phone call and Victor's release passed with an unbearable, watchful quality I hadn't felt since the week the divers searched the lake. Every car on the street a possible threat. Every unfamiliar number on my phone a small jolt of adrenaline. Ethan and Grace kept deliberately close to home under the thin cover story of a family project neither of them fully believed. What none of us knew yet was that Victor, released and furious, had already found the one thread he needed to locate us. A local news photographer's crowd shot from the Harvest Festival, posted online that same week. That happened to show Sarah's face clearly in the background of an unrelated caption about prize-winning pies. He came to the house 2 nights later, while Ethan was at a friend's, while Grace and Sarah and I were sitting in my kitchen trying to figure out, of all things, sleeping arrangements for a family that had just doubled in size overnight. I heard gravel shift under tires that didn't belong to anyone we knew, and something in Sarah's face told me, instantly and without a word, exactly who had just arrived. I want to be honest that the next 15 minutes are not ones I can describe with total clarity. Adrenaline does strange things to memory, but I remember standing between Victor Kessler and my daughter on my own front porch, remember his voice, calm in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been, telling Sarah she'd made a mistake coming back somewhere he could find her. For a long, terrible stretch of seconds, nobody moved. Victor's eyes moved slowly from Sarah to Grace to me, doing some private, unhurried calculation I didn't want to understand. And I remember thinking, with a strange kind of clarity, that whatever happened in the next minute, I was not going to be the one who stepped aside. I remember Grace's hand gripping the back of my jacket. I remember the specific, enormous relief of headlights sweeping across the driveway roughly 90 seconds later, because Detective Wynn, working off a tip from a marshal tracking Victor's movements since that morning's release, had already been 3 minutes from our street when the call came through. Victor Kessler was taken into custody on our front lawn, calmly enough that Ethan's friend's mother, dropping him home 20 minutes later, mistook the flashing lights for a minor traffic stop down the block. He was held this time without the technicality that had freed him before, charged with a decade-old pattern of stalking and endangerment, that Tom Riley's careful documentation made almost impossible to argue against, and denied bail while awaiting trial on charges serious enough that even his lawyers, according to Detective Wynne, stopped promising him an easy outcome. For the first time in 10 years, Sarah told me, she went to sleep that night without running through an exit plan in her head before she closed her eyes. Word moved through a town the size of Millbrook Falls exactly as fast as you'd expect, and within a week, half the customers at the hardware store were finding gentle, roundabout ways to ask if the rumors were true. I answered honestly, mostly because I'd spent 10 years being honest with Ethan about hard things, and it felt strange to start hiding the truth from everyone else now that the reason for hiding it had finally been arrested. The months after that were not a fairy tale exactly, and I think it would be dishonest to describe them as one. Ethan and Grace circled each other cautiously at first, two teenagers who shared a mother and a face shape and absolutely no shared history, before eventually settling into the particular, unglamorous ease of siblings who'd simply decided, independently, that they liked each other. By the following spring, Grace had talked Ethan into teaching her to fish off the same dock where he'd learned as a 4-year-old, and the two of them spent an entire Saturday afternoon arguing cheerfully about whose technique was worse, a sound I hadn't realized how badly I'd missed until I heard it drifting up from the water while I fixed the very roof I'd never quite gotten around to repairing a decade earlier. Sarah and I did not simply pick up where we'd left off 10 years earlier, because the people we'd been at 31 no longer entirely existed, but we started, slowly, the deliberate work of learning each other again, one honest conversation at a time, without any of the secrets that had, however lovingly intended, cost us a decade. We started with weekly dinners that Ethan and Grace both rolled their eyes at and never once missed. And somewhere around the 4th or 5th one, I noticed Sarah had started, without seeming to think about it, chewing on the end of her pen again exactly the way she used to, as if some small, guarded part of her was finally allowing itself to unclench. On the 1-year anniversary of that harvest festival, the 4 of us stood together at the edge of Millbrook Falls Lake, at the same stretch of shoreline where searchers had once pulled an empty car from 40 feet of water and released a handful of small paper lanterns onto the surface, watching them drift out into the dark. I remember Grace asking, quietly, whether it felt strange, marking an anniversary of a death that had never actually happened. I told her the truth, that some part of that grief had been real regardless. 10 genuine years of missing someone who'd been alive the entire time, and that the only thing stranger than mourning a person who wasn't gone was getting the impossible, undeserved chance to stop mourning them and start actually knowing them instead. We watched the lanterns drift until they were small points of light on the dark water, and for the first time since that golden October afternoon, when a stranger's laugh stopped my heart in the middle of a crowded festival, I understood that the ending to this particular story was never going to be the one I'd spent 10 years bracing myself for. It was, against every reasonable expectation I'd built out of a decade of grief, a beginning instead. Grace still keeps that old laptop folder of secondhand photographs, she told me recently, except now she adds to it herself, on purpose, instead of searching for scraps from a distance. Proof, she says, that some things are worth documenting simply because you finally get to be there for them.